Before I give my formal remarks, I want to share a vignette from when I visited Beirut earlier this year before I joined the State Department. I had the opportunity to meet with a group of Christian refugees from Iraq and Syria. They had truly heartbreaking stories of tragic loss and displacement, of loved ones lost, and a profound sense that they would never be able to return home. It was tragic to hear and tragic to potentially watch the fading away of a historic community from their ancestral homelands. But it's an experience that's also shared by millions of other Syrian and Iraqis who are overwhelmingly Muslim. And we really we must not let the actions of ISIL in Paris increase the misery of the millions of people who are fleeing the horrible situation in Iraq and Syria. We've got to stay true to our humanitarian principles and assist all who are in need. I want to thank the organizers for inviting me to speak here today. I'm going to talk about my new role at the U.S. Department of State and discuss ways to protect religious minorities in the Middle East and South and Central Asia. I know I'm speaking to friends who support the promotion of religious pluralism and peaceful coexistence, especially now when these values are literally under attack. As the title of this session suggests, to have sustainable communities, we need to build bridges of peace between religions, and that is such a critical effort. I was appointed about 2 months ago to serve as a special advisor on religious minorities in the Near East and South and Central Asia. I was asked to take this role to help address the crisis that is emerging worldwide. And while religious freedom and human rights is a core part of this work, it also has other elements such as fostering interfaith understanding and looking at humanitarian challenges such as refugee issues. The challenge before us is immense. In the past year, we've observed the spread of non-state actors who are now the principal persecutors of religious tolerance, preventers of religious practice in the Middle East. Most prominent and most harmful have been the rise of international terrorist groups such as ISIL and Al-Nusra Front. All these groups have been guilty of vicious acts and unprovoked violence against minority religious communities, as well as against other Muslims who disagree with their warped religious interpretations. And at the same time, we of course deplore the Syrian government's irresponsibility and disregard for the well-being of the lives of its citizens. But the barbarity of ISIL, the Nusra Front, and other groups is well known. As Secretary of State John Kerry recently said, ISIL wants to turn back the clock of civilization a full millennium. We see this when captives report being given the choice of conversion or slavery or death, or when others are just killed outright. Women and children have been among the victims, raped, enslaved, and removed from their families and sold into sexual slavery for just a few dollars. People have been targeted because of their faith. The United States is responding both directly and with the support of the global coalition against ISIL. We're taking robust measures to stop the violence at its source by supporting the coalition to degrade and defeat ISIL. We're taking action to defend and protect all vulnerable populations in this region. Now, in this new role, I have identified 3 priorities to help further advance these efforts. I offer them now for your consideration as ways that can help create sustainable communities. They are protection, governance, and reform. First and fundamentally, protecting vulnerable religious and ethnic minority communities is critical. And this is especially true in Iraq and Syria. For the first time in 1,600 years, church bells are not ringing in Mosul. This is a tragedy for the Christian community in Iraq and around the world. It's also a tragedy for Iraq itself, a country rich in diversity and a cradle of many great faiths. The Yazidi community, a faith group unique to Iraq and the neighboring areas, has faced an existential threat. In response, the U.S. has engaged vigorously, as probably most of everyone here knows. In August of 2014, as ISIL began its attacks on Mount Sinjar, President Obama ordered airstrikes to help Iraqi forces break the siege and avert atrocities. Since then, we've worked closely with representatives of the Yazidi community in relation to the Yazidis that are still being held held captive by ISIL. But we're concerned about other groups. We're concerned about the 2 metropolitans from Aleppo who remain kidnapped, as well as the hundreds of Christians who were kidnapped more recently in the Cabo River Valley. We've also helped free Turkmen Shia, such as in September of last year when airstrikes in coordination with Iraqi forces broke a siege of the Iraqi town of Emirili, where an estimated 15,000 Turkmen Shia were surrounded by ISIL. But beyond these immediate security issues, the response to meet the protection challenge remains extremely practical. Just about 2 weeks ago, we met with a group of Yazidis from northern Iraq who are still living in tents more than a year after having to flee the threat of ISIL. It was heartbreaking as they shed tears talking about the miserable conditions for adults, but especially for the children. Now, we're doing what we can. We've provided billions in humanitarian assistance to Iraqis and Syrians, including displaced populations and refugees. We applaud the contributions of other donors, and we commend the governments of Turkey, as well as Jordan, Lebanon, and the Kurdistan regional government. But we acknowledge that despite our collective effort, tremendous gaps in assistance remain. Currently, the UN appeals for Iraq and Syria are well underfunded, and with winter approaching, the international community needs to find a way to contribute more. But to have sustainable communities, space is needed. Space in societies is needed for religious and ethnic minorities to live and thrive. And this leads me to my second area of emphasis, governance. Governance is the first and most basic role of governments, and a basic responsibility of any government is to provide security for minority religious communities, people who think and believe differently. We need to find ways to encourage nations to protect religious pluralism and religious minorities. This means standing up for religious minorities through a firm commitment to the rule of law and basic law enforcement, holding the perpetrators of violence accountable when they break the law. It also means steadfastly condemning hateful rhetoric, intolerance, racism, and xenophobia. Also part of this answer is ensuring that members of religious minorities have a voice and a place at the table as equal citizens vested with equal rights. When diverse communities, including religious and ethnic minorities, are represented in government, protected equally by trusted security forces, and represented in a society that enables freedom of religion and the chance for decent livelihoods, societies are stronger, more prosperous, and more stable. Religious and ethnic diversity must be viewed as strengths and not weaknesses. In addition, there's a challenge of protecting religious sites and stopping the illicit sale of religious relics. I've heard repeatedly from religious groups about their patrimony being illegally looted or destroyed. So if we're trying to create conditions for religious communities to stay in their ancestral homelands, the international community must find ways to protect the places and things that connect them to that land. For instance, in August, the FBI issued an alert to art dealers about stolen antiquities by ISIL from the ancient sites in Syria and Iraq. And I think this is an area where more work can be explored and pursued. And then lastly, with respect to reform, the third area of emphasis, sometimes governments are part of the problem and not the solution. Pressure should be brought to bear to see reforms made so that restrictive laws and policies are changed and members of religious minorities are able to practice their faith freely and peacefully. With the full participation of all individuals, including religious minorities, societies can be much better positioned to unleash human talent and advance human dignity that strengthens peace, security, and prosperity. In this effort, we must also examine education materials that teach exclusion and discrimination. No child should be taught that the religious other is not to be valued because of a different faith or belief system. Sadly, a generation or more of children have been exposed to intolerant and sometimes violent messages in the classroom. We need to find ways to provide a counter-narrative that teaches the value and beauty of diversity and respect for human rights and religious freedom. In closing, we as a community with many shared values, coming from different faith communities and societies, we must help nations everywhere recognize that they will do better when religious diversity is protected and religious freedom is respected. possible disappearance of communities across the Middle East should provoke us all to action. We cannot see the loss of communities that were so intricately embedded into these societies. The potential loss is a sober reminder of what we all lose when minority religious communities are persecuted and left unprotected by their governments. So the challenge is immense, but I believe by working together we can successfully push back against these forces of intolerance. We must all endeavor to protect religious pluralism so that religious diversity and freedom of belief is ensured. And I harken back to the meeting I had in very earlier this year where I met with this group of Christians. One pastor was so despondent, he said, "I don't even know what to pray for regarding Syria." But at the same time, he was very encouraged that the international community cared. So I think it's incumbent upon all of us to find ways to help. Thank you.